It's Tuesday afternoon at 4 p.m. in Switzerland. It's Space Café WebTalk time. Our Space Café WebTalk 33 minutes with Daniel Porras will begin soon. Thank you for joining us for this exciting event. We expect a truly global audience for our Space Café WebTalk today. We also appreciate your ongoing feedback. I'm Torsten Kriening, your host today and co-publisher of SpaceWatch.Global. We're a Switzerland-based online platform for information in and about space and new space activities in a geopolitical context. I hope many of you already know our website, our bi-weekly newsletter, and our daily newsletter. Last week, we released the second episode of our Space Café podcast. Check your inbox or subscribe to the newsletter on our website. I may be biased, but I really think that the podcast is very cool. Check it out. We will be hosting our Space Café Web Talks on a weekly basis. I hope you mark Tuesdays at the same time in your calendars already. Let's do some housekeeping. Please be informed that we are recording this webinar session and we will make it available on SpaceWatch.Global in a few days. We are also streaming Space Café live on Facebook, or at least we try it. Usually it works, but we never know. If you would like to ask a question, just use the Q&A section on the lower end of the Zoom webinar screen as shown here. Not the chat, please. And there's no need to raise your hand. If you hit the Q&A tab, you will be able to type your question and send it over to us. You also can vote for questions. If we don't get to your question during the session, we will try to follow up with you later. We can't guarantee that we or our guest will answer all your questions, but we will try as many as possible. And with that, I'm very honored to call my guest today a friend. So it's a special to have him joining us today. Daniel Porras is based in Geneva and he is Space Security Fellow at UNIDIR, the United Nations Institute of Disarmament Research. I'm sure he will explain that a bit more in detail later. He focuses on political and legal issues surrounding space security, in particular the progressive development of sustainable norms of behavior in space. He conducts research on the emergence of new technologies and approaches to strategic stability in outer space. Daniel was a resident technical expert for multiple UN bodies working on space security issues, including the GGE, the Group of Governmental Experts, or the Prevention of an Arms Race in Outer Space, PAROS. He holds an LLM in International Economic Law from Georgetown University Law Center in Washington, D.C. And Daniel's areas of expertise include international space law and policy, emerging technology threats, international law, and political science. I'm glad to have you, Daniel, here in our show today. Your topic, is it too late to prevent an arms race in outer space? I think it's an interesting question. Includes for me the idea that A, we already have an arms race, and B, that the answer is yes. So it's too late. So question, what are we doing with the next 30 minutes in our talk? The audience is yours. Over to you.
Thank you, Torsten. I really appreciate it. And sir, it is also my pleasure and honor to call you friend as well. And I'm really delighted that you decided to have me speaking today. In regards to the question, is it too late to prevent an arms race in outer space? It's not quite so straightforward as just a very simple, yes, we're there. It's a little bit more complicated than that. And so I just wanted to unpack some of those things so that we could talk today. And this is actually the research that we've been doing at UNIDIR now for quite some time. And it's been quite exciting over the last couple of years because we're seeing this whole new flurry of activities in the area of space security that wasn't really there in previous decades. So in the past, you could argue whether or not there was an arms race in outer space, but now we have a whole new set of evidence to look at. So Let me start by introducing myself. As Torsten said, I'm the Space Security Fellow at the UN Institute for Disarmament Research in Geneva. We're an independent think tank that looks at disarmament and arms control issues. A lot of the work that we do deals with weapons of mass destruction, emerging security technology, conventional arms. But as a part of that, we also look at space security and how it fits into the wider picture. My particular portfolio falls under the program of weapons of mass destruction and other strategic weapons. So as you can see, we're already coming at it from a sort of nuclear-focused, conflict-focused perspective. Now, just as a disclaimer, everything I'm going to say today, these are my views, my personal views. They do not necessarily represent the views of the United Nations or UNIDIR or necessarily any of my other colleagues. I think it's actually good that we don't always see eye to eye on things, because that helps to refine our ideas, and then we can come up with more useful products. I personally have been working on space law and policy now for almost 15 years. I've worked on everything from the European Code of Conduct on space activities. As you said, I worked on the group of governmental experts on prevention of an arms race in outer space. We work with the Conference on Disarmament, servicing member states to help them try and find different approaches to solve some of the challenges that we're dealing with space security. So the big question that we are dealing with now today is, are we in an arms race in outer space? Is it too late to prevent an arms race in outer space? And this is something that the UN has been trying to tackle for a while. Why is the UN trying to tackle this? Well, it just so happens that right around the time when I was born, this is a while ago, the United Nations held a special session on disarmament in the General Assembly. And they said, look, we've got two countries over here, two big military space powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, and they're starting to develop some technologies that can target satellites and potentially destroy satellites. This could potentially lead to an arms race in outer space. So they started talking about this issue called PAROS. Well, we haven't really seen a whole lot of progress in this area, and I think that's for a wide variety of reasons. First, what is an arms race in outer space? What does it even look like? And can you even say that there is an arms race in outer space independent of what's happening down here on Earth? Can you have an arms race on Earth that doesn't involve outer space today? Well, I would say that with our modern militaries, that's pretty tricky. The other issue is that we don't really know what success looks like for the prevention of an arms race in outer space. We often talk about PAROS, the acronym, and people say, well, we need to achieve PAROS because it will prevent destabilization of the space environment, and it will prevent a lot of suffering for people on Earth. Well, okay, but that's a really broad concept. I mean, if you achieve success, what does that even look like? So we kind of started looking at PAROS and this issue and said, well, we need to start at the beginning. And given some of the events that have taken place over the last 2 years, we really need to start asking ourselves, is it too late for this topic? Have we been discussing PAROS for 40 years and just had it slip away from us while we weren't looking? When I say a lot of events have been taking place, I'm sure a lot of the listeners are already aware of things that have been happening. Like, yes, the United States has a space force, but it's not just the United States. We've seen France, Japan, India. They've all come up with their own different versions of a space force. A lot of countries are starting to, or more and more countries are starting to adopt policies specifically aimed at space security. Did you know that Italy had a space security policy, actually? They implemented a space defense policy in July of last year. Mm-hmm. Who knew? But it definitely uses the word deterrence. And what does that mean? What are we talking about when we say deterrence in outer space? What do we mean when we say that we're pulling together military units that are going to be focused on outer space? So for this reason, we said, all right, let's try and take this question apart and see what we've got. First, what's an arms race? From a very basic standpoint, when we talk about an arms race, what do we mean? And my disarmament colleagues can give you all kinds of ideas on this, But at the end of the day, it's rivals seeking advantages over each other by improving or increasing the size of their arsenals. Okay, so, and that's a very simplistic way of looking at it, but essentially that's what we're getting to. So you build missile defense, I build missiles with warheads that have multiple warheads packed in, so that your missiles can't target all of them, or developing different kinds of weapons that will counter the other developments from the other side. And we finally identified 3 indicators of an arms race in space: rivalries, capabilities, and acceleration of development. And we said, okay, if you could tick off these 3 boxes, then the answer is yes, you have an arms race in space. So first one, rivalries. Do we have geopolitical rivalries in outer space? As our good friend John Sheldon has said several times, and I love this quote, geopolitics with a capital G is back. And so from that perspective, we have relationships between the US and Russia, US and China, China and India, and other countries are starting to get wrapped into this, like France and Japan. So from that perspective, we look at rivalries and we say, tick, that's there. Capabilities. Are states developing comparable technologies and capabilities in order to respond to what other countries are developing? And as I'm sure your listeners have heard from Brian Whedon and from a number of other experts, yeah, not only do we have capabilities, the arsenal is expanding. We're seeing a lot of different types of technologies and capabilities that can target satellite systems for disruption and destruction, potentially. Haven't ever been used in the wild, as it were, like in a combat situation, but we know they're there, and we know that states are at least holding open the idea that they might use them at some point. And finally, acceleration of development. That's hard. It's difficult to determine whether militaries are like ramping up their spending on military technologies related to space. I mean, these are things that are classified, but we can see certain proxies and say, that's a sign that things are picking up speed. So the establishment of dedicated military units specifically for military activities in space. We're not just talking about using space as an enabler, but specifically like operations and activities in space. We're seeing changes in policies and doctrines that are now at least accepting the fact that we might be carrying out war-fighting activities in outer space. And we're seeing development and testing of technology. We just had the alleged Russian ASAT test a couple 2 weeks ago now. Last year we had the Indian ASAT demonstration. We've seen a lot of uses of co-orbital vehicles. There have been examples of jamming. I mean, we can maybe quibble about the third point as to whether or not you would check that one. But if it's not a check, like a full check, it's at least a 3/4 one right now. So we definitely seem to be caught in this dynamic of arms racing. And it's not just in space. It's across a lot of domains. So this includes cyber. It includes different types of technologies for like hypersonic weapons, or there was also a torpedo now with a nuclear weapon that could potentially be cruising underwater for years and years, and then eventually, finally hits a target and detonates, and you just never know when it's going to come. It's just a lot of new technologies that are coming. So it's not that Paros has slipped away. It's not that Paros is no longer there. It's just that there is an arms race, and space systems are a fundamental part of modern militaries. So it's almost expected that people are going to look for ways to counter those advantages that you get from space capabilities. So where does that leave us? That's a tricky issue. Yeah, there could be big consequences for the military powers, but what about the rest of us? What about those of us that are not military powers? Other countries could seriously suffer from this, especially if things like kinetic ASATs start getting used because of the buildup of debris and other things. So at UNIDIR, we kind of started like putting our heads together to come up with some different ideas about what we could do to find some targeted, focused, measured ideas that could sort of act as arms control a little bit, and to try to bring things and find areas where there's convergence, where everybody has an interest in preventing some of these, the use of some of the counter space capabilities. So one of the ideas that we looked at is co-orbital vehicles, rendezvous proximity operations. Now we've got these fun vehicles that can go around and fix, they can repair, refuel, or remove satellites from orbit. But they're essentially plug and play capabilities, like Legos. So we think it would be really useful to have some rules focused around the co-orbital vehicles, just so that we can have some clarity and transparency about what the intentions are behind the use of these vehicles. And that way nobody gets nervous when, maybe a small fleet of active debris removal satellites get sent into space. The other thing is space-based missile defense is actually kind of tricky when we talk about space security, because there's really no getting around the fact that space-based missile defense could potentially, not yet, but could potentially in the future, sort of make Russia and China's deterrence less effective. So when we think about strategic stability right now, the big countries have nuclear weapons, and they're all pointing nuclear weapons at each other. Nobody wants to pull the trigger on any of the weapons, because then we're all going to die. However, if one of those parties starts developing a shield for the others, then it might create incentives for the others to use their nuclear weapons. So for better or worse, space-based missile defense could potentially destabilize the relationships between the big nuclear powers right now. And so maybe bringing space-based missile defense into a conversation helps to make ground-based ASAT, so like the missiles that are firing up from the ground, it makes those less desirable if they don't have to worry about a shield in space. So that's another idea. And then finally, the last one is we see a lot of problems that could potentially come from just the testing of anti-satellite weapons. So anything that hits a satellite, causes it to break up, blow up, and send debris shooting everywhere, that's a problem. So we think if we could accept some guidelines on how you do those, if you do them at all, then maybe we can at least mitigate the amount of debris that will be released. So those are our main recommendations. And I just have one fourth one that I would recommend that I think could be really important for the international community, and that is defining what success looks like for PAROS, for the prevention of an arms race in outer space. No one has ever really articulated that officially. And I think if we just say that a success for PAROS could be that people can keep using space the way we use it today, to continue using it for economic, scientific, and some military purposes, that would be ideal. I don't know if we could go any further than that, but at least getting a sense of what we're going for and what it would look like if we win could be good. So those are my comments, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I know that was a lot of information.
Yeah, and not the ones I was looking for. So it leaves me in a deep depression. However,
sorry.
Yeah, no problem. So just one question to follow up. Who could offer these kind of guidelines, or you requested? So who could lead this kind of development, dialogue?
Well, it can come from a number of sources. It would be great if it could come from the Russians or the Americans or the Chinese. We know Dmitry Rogozin, for example, has supported the idea of banning ASAT testing altogether. For those who don't know, he is the director of Roscosmos, the Russian space agency. Likewise, Doug Lavero, who is he's now the head of human spaceflight for NASA. For a long time, he worked in this field as well, and he's a big proponent of banning kinetic ASAT testing because he sees the dangers that the debris can create. But unfortunately, between those countries right now, I think they're tied into a much bigger political game. It would be great if we saw some of the middle space powers come forward and put a proposal out there, because this does interest them. They can say, hey, we think there should be some guidelines on how these weapons are tested, because it could potentially hit our satellites too. So, it could come from a Latin American country like a Brazil or a Chile. It could come from a European country that has no interest in counter space. like a Switzerland or a Sweden or a UK or a Germany. Certainly it could come from a country like the Republic of Korea or New Zealand or Australia. These are countries that are big space actors now, and they have an interest in making sure that that debris doesn't hit them. And I think if you have a lot of the middle space powers, they could act as a bridge between the countries that are still emerging as space countries or that just receive the benefits and the bigger players. But somebody's got to take the lead. And unfortunately right now, I don't think that the big powers are ready to put something forward like that. So it's going to have to come from the one notch down.
Great. So as our format is a very interactive one, so long answer, long question, short answer, that would be cool. So let's kick it off. Last week we had Brian Whedon talking about the third edition of the Global Counter Space Capability Study, or as you mentioned earlier. How would you assess the state of global space security in 2020 compared to the previous years?
It has spiked tremendously, which is, I mean, it's not a lot. Almost nothing had happened since 2007, 2008. We had seen some testing with the Chinese ASAT test in 2007, and then the U.S. Operation Burnt Frost in 2008. But then things calmed down. It's really making us nervous that so many countries are looking at new policies over the last 2 years.
Got it. We can't avoid talking about COVID these days, and we have, because we see you in your living room. So, and we have seen the Russian noodle test and the Italian satellite launchers last week. Does the pandemic have an influence in the arms race, perhaps as an accelerator because we need another focus?
No, I don't think so. I think things have just stayed the course at the moment. The pandemic hasn't really impacted that side of things. I mean, it's affecting a lot of other stuff, and maybe the economics will play out later. But at the moment, it hasn't really seemed to slow anything down. Space Force is already up and running, as we saw.
Yeah, I'm taking a few questions now from the audience because they are very active and sending in questions on the Q&A. Still a few of them use the chat, but we just ignored it. So Victoria asked, from the technical standpoint, how realistic is a space-based missile defense system?
It's not. It's actually not. Well, sensors are likely going into space. It is very likely that you could see a layer of satellites that go up that enable more like better early warning systems. Now, the idea of putting missiles in space, as our good friend Laura Grego has reminded us, it's virtually nothing. It's probably not going to happen. Nevertheless, as my Chinese and Russian colleagues sometimes tell me, and experts, not representative of the governments, but the experts, Daniel, the United States put a man on the moon in 1969 just to prove a point. And who knows if new technologies will make it feasible in the future, but at least for now, it's not in the cards, but it still has an impact on discussions.
Just to follow up on that, when you talked earlier, you talked primarily, if I understood it right, about the orbits around the Earth. So what about cislunar? What about lunar? Because lunar is in these days.
Yeah, I don't think we're going that far just yet. I know there were some concerns, for example, that the Chinese Jade rabbit that landed on the other side of the moon is going to be a military installation. I don't necessarily see that happening. I think it's hard enough just getting to the surface of the moon right now to just land and poke around in the dirt. Probably way too expensive to be thinking about military activities there just yet. And if they were thinking about it, they should know that it's against the Outer Space Treaty.
Okay. Question from Florian. What role can commercial actors play in improving and expanding the dialogue about security and responsible conduct in space between nations?
Yeah. So space operators have a great place to play or a great part to play in this conversation, because they're the ones that could potentially be impacted by things like debris generated from ASAT testing. Likewise, we've seen examples in the past when operators have been jammed, as a consequence of the military services that they were also providing. So I think the commercial sector can come at this from the perspective of saying, if we see increased use of counter space capabilities, it's going to make our operations a lot more expensive, which makes access to space more expensive, meaning that this big, boom of activities that we're seeing lately is going to get cut short. So if you want us to keep doing things in space, you have to try and stabilize things so that there's certainty.
Okay, great. I take a question from John, and as he mentioned earlier in the chat that he is that he loves to listen to you as much as you listen to him.
Oh, it's a huge compliment.
Is there a tautology here? In order to prevent arms race in space, we will have to find a way to make space as a strategic domain, military and strategically useless to states. What are your thoughts on that?
There's a lot to that. I've got an Indian colleague, Narayan Prasad, which a lot of you probably know. Great guy. And we've been having conversations lately about how missiles today, the new missiles, the guidance systems, are no longer dependent on global positioning because they have to be ready for an environment where GPS or any other global navigation system is out. So if missiles, for example, or missile defense didn't depend on satellites, fabulous. Then there's no threat. You don't need a kinetic ASAT to shoot down satellites anymore because it doesn't do you any good. That's a dream. I hope we could get to something like that. But yeah, that would be really useful.
We had multiple questions about the NATO, or what about NATO initiatives on our space arms? Is there anything recent?
This is actually one of my big concerns because it's so vague. Last year, we heard from NATO that they had agreed that space is a domain of operations. And they also said that an attack on a satellite is sufficient to trigger their Article 5 collective self-defense. But they didn't specify what operations they were talking about, and they certainly didn't specify what they considered to be an attack on a satellite. Now, we have a whole range of counter space capabilities that could be used against a satellite. That includes jamming, from something as simple as jamming all the way up to kinetic ASAT that blows up your object. Well, where in that line do we say it's an attack? Like, is it everything? Well, it doesn't seem that way because we know there is jamming today and there's some tolerance. Is it if you blow up my satellite? Yeah, probably that'll count. But until we know where in that line an attack starts, we could have a situation where one country thinks, oh, I'm just kind of poking you a little bit. And another country says, whoa, those are fighting actions and we're going to war right now.
Yeah. Okay. So I have this. Yeah. Are
we okay on time?
Yeah. We have a few more minutes to go. And I have three heavy questions with the really request for a short answer. So is my illusion, or is my ideal idea, is peace in space an illusion? What do you think?
I honestly think that depends on who you ask. If you ask a lot of folks in the Western countries, and Latin America and a lot of other places where you would say, oh, we use satellites for telecommunications, we use satellites for civil science and all these things. Yeah, space is totally for peace. But if you're coming from a country that has experienced any type of conflict with a major military in the last 2 decades, 3 decades, satellites are already used for war. I mean, I know that we often talk about how, well, we accept that satellites being used to help troop movements and do reconnaissance. Those are still more or less considered to be peaceful activities. But it depends on who you are. And if you're somebody that's getting bombed by a drone that is, being controlled by a satellite, that satellite is a part of the military unit. So from that perspective, I don't think we ever had that illusion or had that reality. It always was an illusion.
Got it. As I'm a big believer in the UN and the spirit of the Outer Space Treaty, is the OST still important in playing a role in stopping arms race in space?
Oh, absolutely.
Good. Thank you.
The most important rule on arms control in space is, and the only one really in space, is Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty: no weapons of mass destruction or nuclear weapons in space. Let's not reopen that argument. Yeah.
Okay. My last question, I know it's a difficult one. So when visiting events in Vienna at USA or in Geneva with your organization over the last years, I had the impression that there are two different bodies, different audiences, different countries involved. Am I correct with this assessment? And what can the UNOSA, UNIDIR do together to foster dialogue, to coordinate one dialogue? Because it's obviously needed.
Yeah, and it's a reality. There was a decision early on in this discussion that space security issues should be kept away from the peaceful uses of outer space issues, because the space security stuff is so heavy that it will block activity in any other realm. Unfortunately, what we're starting to see is that safety and security are really tied together. My colleague Letitia Zarkin is actually working on a terrific paper right now about the distinctions between safety and security. And while in the past you maybe could have been able to talk about them separately, what we're seeing now is that it just doesn't work. So I've actually been engaging quite a lot with the chair of COPIOS, this year's chair, Andre Riepel from Brazil. And he and I are very much of the mind that we can have initiatives either in Geneva or Vienna that could support the objectives of the other. So for example, space traffic management. That's probably something that should be taken up in Vienna at COPIOS. But the community here in Geneva can call back to Capital and say, you know what? If we have good space traffic management, that's good for security too. So support that initiative, as it will have benefits for security. And likewise, there are some things that we can do here in Geneva that could have safety benefits. And the Vienna community can support Geneva in a very similar way. So hopefully we'll be able to start communicating a little bit more and not being so scared of each other, and find some common paths.
I'm glad to hear that, honestly.
We try.
Great. Thank you very much. We are running out of time, and I'm afraid we have to come to an end. So even so, I would like to continue talking with you, but be sure that we will follow up with the space security topics on our Space Café WebTalks and in our magazine, of course. Just as an announcement, our next webinars are next week on the 5th of May. I will talk with Frank Salzgeber from ESA, from the Technology Transfer Office, about ESA's support for space entrepreneurs, especially these days. On the 12th of May, I will have our Professor René Laufer as my guest in this webinar to talk with him about the future of small satellites, or I mean, in this light, what we got today, a very interesting topic, I assume. And I'm very happy to announce here that on 19th of May, my wonderful guest will be Vera Pinto from the European Commission, talking with me about a topic that is super important, but not very often addressed. How can space help inclusion and promote equality?
That's a great topic.
All events are online already on Eventbrite, and please register to get your ticket there and get all the information you need. As always, we would like to hear your feedback, so please check in with us on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, send a pigeon or a postal card. That's fine for us as well. Don't forget to sign up for our daily or bi-weekly newsletters. And if you haven't read the huge variety of perspectives from international space experts on the executive order of US President Trump over the last weeks, please check them out on our website. They are worth to read. Thank you all.
Especially the one by PJ Blunt.
I heard about that. Thank you all very much for your interest today. And thank you, Daniel. It was a great pleasure to have you here as my guest. Thanks again to the entire team behind the scene to make that possible and bring it live. Even so, we missed again Facebook Live, but maybe it's a Facebook thing and not our thing. But thanks again for doing this great job again. I hope you all will stay safe and stay healthy, and I hope to see you next week. Thanks for joining us, and have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.